Also.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our event today. So I'm François Yiri, and I'm based at the UCL Institute of Education in London. And I would like now to invite my colleagues to introduce themselves. Should we start with Sarah?
Yes, hello everybody. I'm Sara Boniti. I am a researcher in early years policy, but I am participating with the hat of a parent of a bilingual child who is 5-year-old.
Thank you, Sara. Ludo?
Hello everyone, my name is Ludovica Serratrice and I'm a professor of multilingualism at the University of Reading and also the current director of the Center for Literacy and Multilingualism.
Thank you, Ludovica. And now Liz.
Oh, hello, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Lanza. I'm a professor of linguistics at the University of Oslo and also the director of MultiLing, Center for Multilingualism in Society across the lifespan at the University of Oslo.
Thank you, Liz. Naomi?
Hi everyone, I'm Naomi Flynn. I work with Ludovica at the University of Reading. I'm an associate professor in primary English education. So I'm actually a teacher educator and I'm fascinated by how to support teachers make a good job of teaching children who are multilingual.
Thank you, Naomi. And Ellie?
Hi everyone, my name is Elizabeth Garcia Gonzalez and I'm a PhD fellow at the Center for Multilingualism in Society across the lifespan in the University of Oslo. And I do research in psycholinguistics and multilingual children.
Thank you, Ellie. Okay, so as you know, the aim of our event today is to discuss the main findings of a study, an online survey on language practices in multilingual families during the first lockdown last year in the UK, Ireland, and Norway. My colleagues will explain the aims and the objectives and context of the study in more detail in their presentations. So we will start now with the presentations of the data from the UK, and then we will discuss the data from Norway.
Okay, shall I start then?
Should we start with Ludovica, Naomi? Thank you.
Okay, right, let me just... Can you see?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, I'm just gonna go. Okay, great. So as Froso said, this is an opportunity to share with you the findings of a project that started pretty much a year ago exactly, at the beginning of the first lockdown in the UK and Ireland. And then soon after, our colleagues in Norway used pretty much the same survey to collect data in their country, and Ellie will share the findings of their study later. So the idea really was to see this was a little bit of an opportunity for an intended social experiment, really, something that nobody was expecting. And we had a bit of a brainwave and we thought, well, what's going to happen to those families that for potentially an extended period of time are going to be at home with children away from school and childcare and potentially speaking more of their home languages. So this is where it all started. Oops, sorry, I'm just going to try. See if it works. Yes. Okay. So very briefly before we delve into the results, just some acknowledgements. Some of the people that were involved in the project in the UK are here. Others may be in the audience. I don't know. And a special sort of heads up to Naomi, who is leading on the analysis of the qualitative data, and Alessandra Valentini, who isn't here today, but who was a big help in the quantitative analysis of the survey data. Of course, Froso is here, and then we've got colleagues from Oxford, Cambridge, Mother Tongues, and We Live Language. And also I have to credit Madalena actually for We Live Language with the title of this webinar, Languages in Lockdown. Okay, so I'm just going to give a rationale for the project, which I've kind of done already, and then a little bit the findings, so a snapshot of the language practices during the first lockdown. And then Naomi will continue with some themes emerging with the interviews that we did with the parents of some of these children. So just to give you a sense of the timeline of the project, like I said, it started a year ago. So we kept this survey open between April and July, and we had about more than 1,000 respondents. So that was quite nice to see. And then we continued in August with interviews with 18 families. And Sarah was one of these parents that participated. And then we did a second survey in November last year, although as you can see, attrition rate was pretty massive. So we are really debating on whether to continue with a third survey a year on, or whether more productively perhaps to revisit, as we already planned, interviews with the parents that replied, and we conducted interviews with in August 2020. So to go back to them months later to see if anything had changed, if or if anything that had changed before had remained, or other developments. So this is the timeline of the project, and basically these are the questions that we wanted to ask. So really we wanted to ask to know how multilingual families in the UK and Ireland use their languages. And specifically, we asked a general question about how much did the children use English and their home languages in everyday language and literacy activities. But also we were interested to know if there was an increase in the children's language and literacy activities in the home languages as a function of the fact that the children were spending more time at home with parents who are speakers of these home languages. I have to say that this is an observational study, so we didn't manipulate anything, we were just observing, so we have to be quite careful when we're talking about effects, because this is really not an intervention study. So we have to be careful in finding causation when it may be just it's an association. The other question that we asked, and I'm going to talk only about two of these factors today, are the factors that might predict a change if there was a change. And today I'll be focusing on the children's age and whether the children were already using the home language when speaking to the home language speaking parent. So for example, if you had a parent that spoke Icelandic in the UK, whether the child would also speak Icelandic to the parent, or whether they would answer in English. And then the last question that for some reason has come up as one rather than three, it's really about the longer term changes, if there were any changes, so a year on. And like I said, we're still debating whether to conduct a further survey or whether to focus on interview data. Okay, so what did we do and what did we find? So we had, like I said, about 1,000 responses. We used about 760 of them because inevitably some parents started, didn't finish the survey, or some of them were not actually residing in the UK or Ireland at the time. And we had a good spread of languages, 95 different languages alongside English, as you will see in my lovely word cloud there. In terms of the kind of patterns of language use, when it comes to the parents, in about half of these families, the parents spoke a different language, so they didn't have a common language. And in half of these cases, it's because one of the parent was a monolingual English speaker. So we had families, for example, where one parent was, an Arabic speaker and the other parent a Spanish speaker. And then, of course, the societal language was English. But we also had families in which we had, a Spanish-speaking parent and an English-speaking parent, with, of course, the societal language being English. When it comes to the children, we asked what the children spoke to their siblings. We were we asked what the children spoke to their parents, but we were also very interested to see what languages children spoke to their siblings. So as you will see, a very small percentage of children, only 6%, spoke only the other language, i.e. the non-English language, to their siblings. About half spoke both English and the other language, and then the remaining 48% only spoke English to their siblings. Okay, so this is perhaps a pattern that is quite familiar to many of the multilingual families that might be in our webinar today. One of the things that we asked, because it became obvious fairly quickly that lockdown wasn't just a matter of days or maybe weeks, but more like several weeks, and as it turns out, months. We asked parents whether, and like I said, you know, our survey was open from April until July, and by July there was children that still hadn't been back to school. So we asked parents whether they were worried about the effect of lockdown on English. And I have to say that overall parents were not very worried. And we asked on a scale from 0 to 100, sorry. And it really ranged between 15 to 30. So they weren't really very worried. We did find a significant difference. So parents of secondary school children were less worried than parents of preschoolers. Okay, there was no difference between parents of children in school, but the ones that seemed to be a little bit more worried were parents of preschoolers. And whether the children spoke English or the other language to their parents didn't make a difference in this analysis, so no effect there. And then we asked, this was the overall amount of activity in English and the home language. We asked for a series of activities that ranged from watching TV or streamed programs, using various devices to speak to extended family or friends over the over the phone, Skype, FaceTime, Zoom, you name it, using gaming, computer games, and then speaking to their siblings. And overall, again, as you might expect from the pattern that I've already sort of indicated before, in absolute terms, children spoke English more than their home languages for all of these activities, really. Interestingly, here again, we see an age effect. So primary and secondary school children used more English than younger children that were not at school yet. And again, there were no differences as a function of age when it comes to the home languages. So we didn't find any differences there. I'm going to show you some plots now that I'll have to explain, because these are what we call pirate plots. So you may or may have not seen them before. And this is what they look like. So this is the language activities during lockdown. At the top, we've got English. At the bottom, we've got the other languages. And in blue, we've got using the internet to communicate with family and friends. In yellow, it's computer games. In red, talking to siblings. And in green, watching streamed programs or TV. And as you can see, so these plots, as you see all those little dots, if you can see them, those are actual data points. So these are actually parents, individual parents' responses. The black lines are central tendencies. So I would say like the mean, the average. And then the size, so how fat the graph is, corresponds to how much data there is at that level in the graph, okay? So as you will see overall, just looking at those horizontal bars, there was definitely more use of English in absolute terms than the other language. And also one thing that is, and the variation in the home language is also more striking, okay, as you can see, because it's a lot more distributed along the vertical axis. And as you can see, the glaring difference is the fact that children were really not using the other language to play computer games at all. So the yellow bar is really sort of, skewed towards the bottom, although as you can see, there are data points all the way to the top. So some children obviously did use that. Okay, when we talk about literacy activities, so we asked about reading and writing. And so in this chart here again, same ideas. We've got English reading in blue, English writing in yellow, and then other languages in reading in red, and other languages writing in green, as you would expect, because these were still children that were going to school, albeit online. There was still a lot more reading and writing in English than in the other languages. But again, interesting to see the variation in the home language. So there is really like a big spread. We didn't find any difference when it came to English between primary and secondary school children, again, as you would expect, because these were still children that were going to school in some way. And when we're looking at the other languages, we didn't find age differences. And as you will see, the amount was pretty low anyway. But this is an interesting finding. Children were significantly more likely to read and write in the home language if they use this language to speak with their parents, okay? So a child was significantly more likely to read and write in Italian if they were already using Italian to speak to their Italian-speaking parent. So that was an interesting finding, we thought. Then this is the other set of questions. So those were the questions where we asked, overall, how much do they do this? And then we asked, compared to before the lockdown, do children speak and or write, read more than before the lockdown in the home language? Okay, so this was a really important question that we wanted to get to. So again, an age effect. So we did not find differences between primary and secondary school children. But preschoolers did use significantly more of the other language than school children. Okay, so compared to the lockdown, there was an increase, but only for the younger children. Again, overall, there was more use of the home language in families where children already spoke that language. Okay, so it seemed to be that there was like a leg up for those families where the language was already used. And then finally, when we're looking at literacy activities, again, we asked, did they read and write more in the home language compared to lockdown? And here we've got in blue, so we're comparing reading, which is in yellow, this is only home languages, to two other activities, which is hearing, opportunities to hear the home language more in blue, and speaking the home language more in red. So as you can see, looking at those black bars, reading is really pretty depressed. Again, a lot of variation, we didn't find any differences between primary and secondary school children, and in this case there were no differences as a function of whether they already spoke the same language as the home language speaking parent. Okay, as you can see, sort of literacy activities really didn't get sort of the leg up that speaking got in this sense. And then we asked finally two questions, one about well-being. So whether speaking the home language during lockdown was a source of well-being or a source of tension. Okay, so, and I have to say overall well-being was rated really highly. So again, we had a scale from 0 to 100, and there was a lot of variation again, but it was around 60, so pretty highly rated. And tension was low, so tension really ranged from 10 to 20 on a scale from 0 to 100, so pretty low. But the interesting finding was that there was higher tension associated with the use of the other language for parents of primary school children. Okay, so these primary school children that were maybe exposed to more home language, and when the parents perhaps wanted to use the home language a little bit more with, that created a little bit of friction in this age group. Okay, so take-home message from the survey data, and then I will pass on to Naomi for some insights from the interviews. So this is what we kind of expected, to be honest, when we launched the survey, because we figured that, if you're a 15-year-old and you've only ever used English with your parents, it's probably unlikely that you start using, Swedish more with them after, a couple of weeks or maybe even a couple of months. So we were interesting, it was interesting to find that change was possible, but only for the younger children. Okay, so consistently we found an increase, but only in the preschoolers. And then for some activities, we also found an interesting significant effect of whether there was a shared language between parent and child. So whether the children were already using that language. So overall, that seemed to make an effect. So in general, like I said, there wasn't like a massive qualitative shift from not using the home language to using it, but we'll see, that something from the qualitative data is telling us otherwise. And then in general, well-being well-being was rated highly in connection with the use of the home language, but there seemed to be a little bit of tension in the case of primary school children, probably because maybe there were, it's in the kind of a little bit of a gray area in which perhaps parents might have tried to reclaim the home language a little bit more. Maybe for the secondary school children, they just, gave up a little bit and just thought, well, it's too late now. But, if you're 7 or 8, there might be a little bit more of opportunity there. And perhaps, from the children's a little bit of a push to still, this very strong pressure from the societal language. So we can certainly discuss this more in the Q&A, but these are basically some of 3 findings that I wanted to highlight from our survey. So I think I can pass on to Naomi. And Naomi, you can do like Chris Whitty. And
Yes, do. Next slide, please.
Slide. Okay.
So we decided to interview as well, and we wanted to find out not just what parents said, but also what the children said. And what we did was we took the broad headlines from the survey outcomes that Ludo's just presented to you, and we used those to drive the interview questions that we set, which are on the right-hand side of this slide here. So they were kind of follow-up in a way to kind of try and dig below some of the data that we got from the survey data. And we issued those for parents to respond to, and we also had a set that was similar but child-friendly for children. So families were invited to interviews. So in some cases we interviewed families, in some cases it was just the parents, and in other words it was children. If you go to the next slide, Ludo, we can see the what the participants were looking like. So we had 18 families responded. They were overwhelmingly, I would say, of a high level of educational professionals. Some of them were even kind of PhDs with linguistics and probably knew more about multilingualism than I did, probably almost certainly. So it was not altogether a representative sample in terms of those that we had responding to the survey, but very interesting all the same. You can see there we had about 7 of the 18 were from London, and the rest were from North, South England and around. We had mostly European languages in those that responded, but we've also got an Arabic-speaking parent, and Bete and Igbo, which are both Nigerian languages, and Mandarin indeed. So quite a range going on there, even within the European languages. If we could just go back one, Ludo, I want to make one more point there. So you can see on the on the right-hand side, parents were asked, did your language use change in lockdown? And more said no than said yes. But what the interviews did was they actually showed us that even when they said no, there were some nuances of change. Yeah, thanks. Next slide now, Ludo. So these nuances of difference between families were interesting. So in a way, the interviews, we're only looking at 18, we're looking at 18 case studies rather than kind of all of those that responded to the survey. And so we didn't find anything that kind of was shockingly different from the survey, but we did find elements of difference between families that were interesting. And so mostly parents had appreciated the greater level of exposure to home languages that lockdown had offered, but they noted differences between their children, particularly age-related, and some preschool children seem to have a kind of home language explosion, which was exciting, and we're going to hear more from that, more about that from Sarah later. And many parents commented on this welcome opportunity to reinforce non-English identity through greater use of home languages. So the next few slides, you can go to the next one, please, Ludo, just give us some broad headlines and some quotations from some of the children and adults that we interviewed. So in terms of purposes for language use in the home, they identified very much that English was the language of schooling, whereas home languages were used more for social activity. And there was some variation in this depending on where one parent was an English-only speaker, but it wasn't consistent across all the families necessarily. Interesting quotation on the top there from family 9. This is a German mum who is used to actually speaking to her children in German all the time, but chose during lockdown to start speaking in English for homeschooling because it was just quicker to do that. We want to move to the next one, Ludo. So families also commented, as we knew from the survey, on this enhanced exposure to family languages, and most of this commented on the benefit of this for strengthening their non-English identity, which was really nice. So family 2 here, although the father in this family also always spoke with his children in Icelandic anyway, he was speaking with them more because he was working from home. So that was a definite shift, even though that was one of the families that said no, there were no changes. And the family 8 as well, in terms of Igbo, this kind of really appreciated the opportunities they'd had during lockdown to grow their children's sense of cultural identity, which was lovely, whilst living away from home and in England. Next slide, thanks, Ludo. This is perhaps a really interesting slide. So these age-related differences were so variable between families, it was very hard to generalize. But I've given you two quotations here from one family who were German-speaking. Both parents were German-speaking. And the daughter said this about her language use, that she found it, she used to find it hard to choose whether to speak English or German, but what lockdown had done was it somehow had firmed up for her in her head what it was to speak, you know, when to use either, which was really interesting. Whereas her younger brother had, as his mother put it, pivoted towards German and was now using much more German and preferred reading books and was much more motivated to read in German than in English. And she had some anxieties about how that was going to play out once he got back into school. So lots of variations there, but bore out what the survey showed us about younger children mostly adopting more use of home languages than older children. Next slide, thanks, Ludo. And as we're going to hear a little bit more about later, also very young children, preschool children, a lot of joy from parents who noted their children starting to speak with them in home languages for the first time, or children who hadn't been speaking much at all, but doing that in home language rather than English. So a lot of positive affirmation around that, which was really nice. And I think we have one more theme around literacy on the next slide. So another thing that parents noted was that lockdown had opened up an opportunity to focus on learning to read and to learning to read in home languages. And I love this second quotation here, that we all remember getting those Amazon packages during lockdown and then being the highlight of our day because there was so little else going on. And this fed into children's use of literature at home. Indeed, the German family that I referred to a couple of slides back, where the 9-year-old boy had started to read much more in German. The other thing that mother was doing with her children was cooking with them in German and using cooking German recipe books. So, you know, really quite a lot of change around literacy use for some families, not across the board. So moving on to what I think is our final slide, another thing that was really important to take into consideration around these interviews is that pre-lockdown language practices, of course, were different between families. And I guess this played out in the survey data as well. And that, to some extent, determined how they were going to respond to both the survey and the interviews. And also schooling choices were different. And I think that also made a difference. So some had children in private schools where they were getting mother tongue input, for example, or in free schools. So free schools, for the sake of people who are not living in England, are schools that are state-run but are free from state ruling, if you like. And so they've made choices like that. So those sort of nuanced differences in family practices, along with whether somebody was English and whether they had access to things like IT to learn other languages, were also, you know, important considerations. I think I'm done there. Am I within time? I hope so.
Thank you, Naomi and Ludovica. This was fantastic. Thank you so much. So as I said in the chat, you can ask any questions you want on the presentations using this Q&A forum, please. Yeah, and we will try to just discuss any questions at the end during the Q&A session. Thank you. So now we will just hear from Liz and Elizabeth about the Norwegian data. Are we ready?
Yes, just gonna share my screen.
Thank you.
All right, I think you can see. Perfect.
Yes, it's fine.
Okay. So I'm going to try to be brief, because I think the most important thing of today is actually having that opportunity to have a lot of questions between the participants and I and all of us. But so as it was already introduced at the beginning, there was a few of us that were thinking about how interesting it would be to look at the influence of the lockdown in multilingual families. And we were thinking about this at the same time. And luckily, we heard that Ludovica and her colleagues were already starting this in the UK. So we got in touch with her and we adapted that same survey to the Norwegian context. So the survey was pretty similar, but just with a little bit of a few tweaks. And so I'm just going to go very briefly, but before I go into the results, I would like to talk to you about what Norway is. So I don't know how much you know about Norway, and if what you think is that Norway is a place where it's very cold and it snows a lot, you would be right. And Norway is well known also for its long, white winters. And in some ways, the lockdown has felt like a very long winter. But you also have to remember that Norway also has a midnight sun, and it always comes around sooner or later. So we also hope that the end of the pandemic will be soon here. So before I go into sort of the background information of the families that participated in the study, I would also like to stress sort of the context of Norway. So in comparison to other European countries, and certainly to the UK, even though Norway is a pretty big country in terms of its extension, it's actually pretty small in terms of population. So there's only about 5 million in the country. So the responses that we got were about 200 responses. Which, considering the population, I think is a pretty fair number. And something that I think is very fascinating is that we had over 45 languages in the questionnaire, which also shows that Norway is also a very multilingual country in that sense. And responses came from all different regions in Norway, even though, of course, we had a lot more representation of Oslo. And there was also a lot of many different languages. Of course, there was a big representation of European languages, but there were also, African languages and Southeast Asian languages. And surprisingly enough, there was actually not so much representation of some of the minority languages that exist here in Norway, like the Sami languages, for instance. But that's something that we can perhaps discuss later if you're interested. And the families that participated were also pretty diverse in terms of the ages of the children. So there were families with very young children and families with a lot older children, but I have to say that the majority of our participants had children in preschool age. So I would also like to point out the level of multilingualism of these families, because for the vast majority of these families, they had at least 2 languages, whether that was Norwegian and another language, or 2 different languages like Spanish and Dutch, for instance. So I think it shows also something very interesting in that sense. And there were other families that even had 3 or 4 or even 5 languages, which I think is quite remarkable. And so, as it was already kind of introduced before, we had the survey had 3 main sections on top of the background information that we collected. So there were questions about overall beliefs about multilingualism. We also asked about the language used during the during the lockdown and social distancing measures. And lastly, questions about the impact of school closures during the lockdown. And I'm just going to talk about 1 or 2 questions per section. So one of the most interesting findings, I think, is that for the vast majority of our families, being multilingual was regarded as very important, not only for themselves, but also for their child's identity. And I think it's quite important to take note of on that, because whether a parent thinks that being multilingual is important for their identity, they might be more likely also to pass on their language and culture and heritage into their children. So I think that was pretty interesting. And then moving on to questions regarding language use during the lockdown, something that I found very interesting was that, again, considering that the majority of our, or a big proportion of our participants had kids in preschool age, is that some of most of the parents reported that they read to their children in Norwegian as much as in other languages, which I think is it's pretty interesting, considering that Norwegian is obviously the language of the society and the language of education. So I think it's pretty interesting that these parents seem pretty invested in providing both languages when it comes to reading to their children. And another very interesting finding is the fact that we found a very important presence of English in online spaces. So of course, this was a bit more relevant for the older kids that could actually play computer games or video games, or were allowed to watch TV more often. But English was definitely the language where all of those activities were happening in. However, I think it's important to also understand the context of, or the role of English in Norway, because For a very significant number of the families in Norway that are multilingual families, not just the ones in the questionnaire, English is often a third language, whether that is parents that are speaking English between the two of them, but also the fact that English has a role in society in day-to-day activities. So it's not strange that you actually, that these kids go to school and they see other parents speaking English to their kids or to the teachers. And also it's not rare that you go to a shop or to a restaurant and you actually find someone that does not speak Norwegian and is employed in that establishment. So I think that's important to take into account because it definitely plays an important role in this context. And then lastly, but not less importantly, that showed a little bit strange. Anyway, I would like to stress the perhaps biggest finding, which was basically the main research question of the study. So knowing that for families who raise multilingual children, we know that the home language tends to move to a second place as children grow up and go to school. We were really wondering whether the lockdown had a positive impact in these home languages. And the overall answer was, again, yes. However, it is important to stress that we had a great deal of variation in the linguistic and cultural background of these families that participated in the study. And even though there was this overall agreement that the lockdown had a positive impact in the home languages, we have to make a distinction between those families that had Norwegian at home and the families that did not have Norwegian at home, because the families that did not have Norwegian at home, of course, not being able to go to work, not being able to take their kids to school is only something that they felt impacted their Norwegian, their own Norwegian, and their children's Norwegian. And I would like to end by highlighting one of the questions of the survey that I think also Ludovica pointed out as well, which is the question of well-being. And so we asked parents whether they thought that multilingualism was a source of well-being in their family, a question for which we also found a great deal of positive agreement. And I would like to leave you in today reflecting on this, because in a time where going home is not exactly at the tip of our fingers, language is something that can certainly bring you comfort and relief. And language might just be the way to go home. So on that note, I would like to leave you here and just invite you to ask any questions if you have them. And of course, I want to thank you everyone for being here today, and for the families who participated in our study. We're deeply grateful. If you want to get in touch with me, you can just scan the QR code down there if you want to, and I'll just leave it here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That was great. Thank you. So as I said, we will discuss any questions you may have at the end of the presentation, at the end of this session. So now I would like to invite our parent, Sara Boniti. And Sara, could I ask you a few questions?
Yeah, of course.
Yep. So I would like to ask you what, if anything, changed in your family in terms of language used during the first lockdown? And secondly, were any of these changes sustained over time a year later?
Sure. Well, thank you everybody again for inviting me. I don't have any slides, so you have to cope with me rambling around. As a disclaimer, I was also a preschool teacher in California in an Italian immersion preschool. I'm Italian myself. So when I had my daughter, who was born in California, I knew what I was up against because my husband is American and does not speak a word of Italian. And I had observed the struggles of many families depending on whether one of the parents was English speaker or not, and the difference in just the path, the journey that they take. So when my daughter was born there and lived there for the first 13 months, and it was always me, so I've always spoken Italian to her. I've always been 100% consistent, textbook, raising multilingual child. lots of books in Italian, if TV, everything in Italian. We moved to Italy for 5 months. When she was around 1 year, she went to nursery there for 5 months. And what happened is that she ended up teaching the other children to say hi and bye, rather than her starting to speak in Italian. So we moved to London when she was 1.5 years, and the frustration was extremely high because we knew that she was 100% passive Italian. She understood everything and would just refuse even to say ciao, to my great sadness and big parental failure moment. I think lockdown, I'm one of those, we were discussing that, I'm one of those success cases as lockdown hit us in the UK, when my daughter has just turned 4. She had been full-time nursery, 9 to 5, 5 days a week in English. So of course, English was the dominant language. Again, she understood everything. I was very consistent, but she's never, ever, ever answered back in Italian. She would speak imperfect. She was also quite advanced. She started very early on to make long sentences. She was almost 2 when she was like blurbing up like entire sentences, quite advanced, but in English. And then she would throw in all these words in Italian, but just random words. And lockdown hit us. We were all at home. It was quite clear that Daddy was not good at playing family, which meant that it was all on me. And if anybody has a 4 or 5 year old and you know the film Frozen, I have lost count of how many coronation days I've had in a single day. But again, back to textbook, child development or language development or everything, I think that was the one most important thing that helped in my daughter's journey. Because and in hindsight, I realized, yes, I was always consistent in speaking Italian with her. But during lockdown, I actually used Italian for something that interested her, which was pretend play. And so day after day after day of 10 weeks of pretend play and puppet shows and anything that was not just the language that you used to, let's get ready in the morning, toothbrush, toilet, nappy, let's go to nursery, bus. So it wasn't this single like task to do in Italian. It became something that was extremely relevant to her. And so we noticed that her Italian exploded. So I'm one of those cases where it just went all over the moon. And the biggest thing was she was still not talking much in Italian. Her understanding was excellent, but she also started to be more confident and comfortable in trying to speak with my mom. For example, we would have lots of FaceTime calls with my family in Italy, more than my husband would like, but she was very excited about trying. While before she was always like whispering, can you tell that to Nonna? She was like trying to talk to grandma, and of course I was next to her in tears of joy. So that was the biggest thing during lockdown number 1. I was also aware, well, let's say my stress level went down because I always felt like a bit of a failure in her not answering Italian, despite me being like so on top of it. Even my husband can read basic Italian books now because he tries. But I felt less anxious, and she went back to nursery, and then she started reception year, which is the first year in school in the UK. I knew that English would reemerge over Italian, but I felt more relaxed. So I think the other thing that happened is that I was not looking at my daughter with disappointment. And not disappointment in her, but disappointment in me. So I think maybe I was more relaxed and she picked on that. And so that was really good. I think it was a major milestone in our relationship. And then lockdown happened again. Well, actually, then the other, in terms of like long-term, what stayed, actually things didn't just stay, things improved even more. And I think I was just extremely lucky that my mom came to visit us for 2 weeks over Christmas, and she got stuck for 6 weeks. And you could see in 1 week that my mom was here, my mom doesn't speak a word of English. So the textbook opportunity and necessity They were all there. And in 1 week, my daughter starts speaking perfect Italian. I mean, not perfect, but like complete sentences to my mom, of course, not to me. She started doing a perfect code switch. She would talk to my mom in Italian, turn around to me and speak in English, whatever, I'll take it. My mom got stuck, her Italian got amazing. And then by chance, we also have now a babysitter who's Italian, actually from my hometown. So my daughter started picking up the dialect. That's a separate story that I'll tell Ludovica. But as soon as my mom left, my daughter turned to me and started speaking to me in Italian. And now she speaks to me in Italian, and has never happened before. So again, that not only just stayed, but now we feel like the foundation is so solid that she went back to school and she now speaks actually in English with mistakes that come from Italian structure, which is quite interesting. I am, disclaimer, absolutely not worried about that. English will always be her dominant language. She's starting to read and write 2 years before than children do in the rest of Europe, so it's okay. But it's quite interesting because she's now doing the opposite. So she's reverting the way that she makes mistakes. And we have a hard time disciplining her because she speaks back to us in Italians, and we are so moved that she does it in Italian that we can't even get upset. So that has been our big silver lining of all our lockdown. One bit I'll add, and then I'll stop, I promise. My husband doesn't speak Italian. He tried many times. He tries really hard. He's always been 1000% supportive. But also because we moved to London, and my daughter has a perfect Oxford accent, it is quite common in our family to make fun. I don't know, that's not really nice in English, but like to mock, to make fun of accents. And so she makes fun, like she switches, like, I'm gonna talk like daddy, can I have water? And so she's like, she really understands that there are different languages, that there are dialects, that there are accents. And I think we make it such a fun thing, like a part of our quirkiness in the house, that it just became normal to her. And I hope she doesn't do that outside the house. But I think that has been like really making it relevant to having conversations about what she is interested to talk about, rather than just like motherhood tasks and getting through the day. And I'll stop here, I promise.
Thank you, Sarah. That's so interesting and such a successful story indeed. And it's great to just hear that your little one kind of, she's so productive in Italian, in the minority language at the moment. Well done. So there were several, actually, when you just registered for this event, we asked you to note down any questions you may have. So this is the time to just ask these questions. So we will ask our panelists in turn. May I ask the MultiLing team from Norway to answer these questions? So either Elizabeth or Liz. So how can you motivate migrant parents to encourage their children to learn their heritage language? This was one of the questions.
Mm-hmm. You can hear me, yeah. First of all, thank you, Ludo, and thank you to your team as well for inviting me and Elizabeth to this event. How to motivate? Well, first of all, it's going to be, I think, Sarah, you gave a very poignant account of how you motivated your daughter. And actually, you've touched on a lot of the questions that did come up in the registration as well. So hopefully we can resort back to that as well. But essentially, it's going to be activities that motivate the children, but it's also how you talk to them. Children that don't read yet, of course, it depends on their age. You can use different interactional strategies that contribute to or encourage their using the home language or the heritage language. You've been using the term home language. I know there's a big discussion. What do we call it? The minority language, as long as everyone knows it's not the language of the general society. I'd like to refer, actually, there are lots of, well, you gave some examples, but there's one study, I can refer to some studies actually. There's one study of a little boy. His mother was Catalan, his father was English, and his name was Andreo. And when he was 3, the father felt that he had at least a basis of English, and he wanted the child to learn more. And so he used a very child-friendly and effective way to insist on English by making use of 2 puppets. And I think this has come up, you've mentioned that as well, and I've seen that on blogs as well. And in that family, they insisted that those puppets that the child was very interested in only spoke English. And I remember they were in Catalonia. And after that, the child's English improved significantly. So that was very, very, very interesting. And I must, as you know, I don't have little kids, I have grandkids, but my kids, I raised them bilingually in Norway. I myself am also originally American. And I can remember back in the day, English was actually a minority language. It doesn't have the prevalence that it has today in Norway. We didn't have social media and so forth and so on. And whenever I would go back to the US, I would get something to help motivate them to use English, especially once they started reading. And one example I like to give is with my son, who at the age of 8, 9 years old was really very much into basketball. And so what I did is I got a subscription to a basketball magazine for children, in a sense, and he would really look forward to that and receiving that. And I would buy books on basketball. So it was like he didn't realize it was Mom's attempt to get him to read. It was basically feeding him with stuff that he loved to devour, right? So I guess the bottom line is motivation, is getting them to realize that this language is very exciting. It's the doorway to something that's very interesting for them. And thank you, Sarah. I think you also gave some very good examples there. Ellie, do you have any examples you'd like to give in regards to that question?
I mean, I think I just agree with you that you need to find something that is it's a source of motivation for them. I mean, it's not just for children as well, but when adults learn another language as well, they also do it better if they actually are motivated on something that they get from that language. So we see that with different ages as well. So I definitely agree with what you're saying.
Yes, Ludo. Yep.
Sorry, try to unmute myself. Yes, thank you. One thing that also sort of often comes to my mind is giving children a sense that they're, you know, as Liz said, you know, heritage language, home language, whatever we want to call it. I know terminology is, you know, to some extent a little bit controversial, but anyway, the non-societal language, let's say, in a society in which you know, another language is the majority language, is also giving children the sense that these are the languages, are bona fide language, and there are worlds out there, there are countries out there that actually use this language. And I'm just going to give you an anecdote from a German-speaking colleague at Reading who had a daughter who was about 4, and again, like Sarah, she was always speaking German to her to, you know, a moderate degree of success. And then one day they were flying back to Germany, like they'd done so many other times before, but this time was Lufthansa. So they did the, you know, safety announcement in German before English. So then suddenly this child realized that German was a really important language, because if they were telling you stuff to stay alive in German before English, you better pay attention. And then she was saying that, you know, that was a little bit of a trigger, a catalyst, thinking, okay, it's not just mummy's language or, you know, my babysitter's language. It's actually an important language that I should. So that, you know, one of these, you know, motivation, but also I guess a sense of pride of the fact that there is a community of speakers out there is important. But it's sometimes difficult, right? If the parents don't have the opportunity to travel to another country. But yeah, so that was something that really stayed with me. And Naomi, you might know who I'm talking about, but.
Definitely. Thank you. Thank you. There are a few more questions that we would like to ask. May I ask Naomi? So the next question is, how do children or their families sustain and develop reading, either alone or together in the home languages? Where do they get their books from? How does reading together in the home language makes them feel? Thank you, Naomi.
Okay, lots of questions here. And you know, I have to make an admission here. I'm the only person on this panel who's not multilingual and didn't raise children multilingually. So shock horror, I've now announced it to the nation. And the reason I'm who I am is because I just got blown away by teaching multilingual children, and they just stayed with me forever. But yes, in terms of reading, I think that Liz actually has already alluded to this a little bit, and so has Sarah, in terms of this motivation. And it's about, you know, finding reading matter that the child wants to read. It's about finding things that are motivational, not worrying about whether they are, I don't know, graded readers or whatever, but they're just textbooks, they're books that the children like, or indeed cookery books like the German mum talked to me about in the interview. That's really important, that it's a pleasurable activity and not a kind of a you really must do this. In conversations I've had, interviews I've had with Polish children, we have a lot of Polish children in English schools. One of the things they find difficult is that they're not as literate in Polish as they are in English, and they find that tension around that with their parents really difficult to deal with. You know, they need to please their teachers by being literate in English, and they need to please their mums and their dads, their families, by being literate in Polish, and that's actually really hard. So I think being aware that you know, literacy in a home language might also be a source of tension is a really, really important thing to just bear in mind. You've asked in your question, where do you get books from? I mean, I'm not really meant to do commercial plugs, but there is one really excellent business that we have here in the UK called Mantra Lingua, who publish many bilingual texts that you might find useful, and other resources as well that are more fun and playful for children to do bilingually. I'm not sure I have evidence about how reading together in the home languages makes the families feel, but I can talk about the fact that in the interviews, the parents certainly found this a very pleasurable activity, this kind of switch during lockdown from only reading in English to sometimes reading in home languages, and that sense of identity that was established by engaging with good, you know, with literature as well as just with the speaking. So I'm sure others might well have experiences that could add to this question around reading and multilingualism.
Thank you, Naomi. That was really useful. Sarah, would you maybe like to share your experiences as a mother reading to her daughter in Italian, or how this relationship, how this is shaped by sharing books in Italian?
Yeah, actually, maybe I've done quite the opposite. I've again been always very strict that I would read in Italian and my husband in English. And as she is now progressing in Italian, it has become a bit more blurred. Sometimes she asks me to read a specific, she's 5, so she's starting to like have preferences, clear preferences for a longer story that we only have in English. And so I read it in English, and my husband tries to keep up with the story in Italian and gets corrected by my daughter. But so we actually went backward, but we've always been very strict, and we do one night and one night. So that's, yeah, that was our experience. In terms of material, actually, that is quite hard. It costs a lot of money, I think. As much as we can, I got all my childhood books that was left in my old house. I brought them to London. When somebody comes to visit, they bring me books. If there is a gift, I always ask for a book in Italian. We have very few books in English because you can get those in the library, so we spend the money for those in Italian. And then we have a group of friends and we exchange books. That was like a good strategy that you can also do socially distanced. I wanted to touch quickly, sorry though, on a question that is in the QA, because it's related to that. And I was actually taking notes about like, maybe this is a great business thing, but it took me months to find some decent apps that were also in Italian. So in terms of games, yeah, I don't want to make publicity, but we subscribe to Disney Plus now because everything gets the Italian translation, while in other, you know, like not everywhere else. But like in terms of apps, it's just really difficult. They are very English dominated, or Mandarin, because there's a big market in the US for Mandarin speaking preschools. But it's just really hard. So that's definitely something that we should lobby for. But yeah, friends, I think, is the biggest, friends and family.
Thank you, Sarah.
Do a startup creating apps in multiple languages.
If I may add
Definitely.
to this, actually, because I mean, obviously before the lockdown, there's always a lot of language activities for different language groups, and parents often organize these things for either Italian or Spanish, or a few friends and I were organizing this for Spanish here in Oslo before the lockdown. And it's a great way to not only help with reading, but also for your kids to realize that there are other people that speak that language, and kind of, you know, bring that motivation that we were speaking about before. And I actually did a little bit of research before all of this started, and there are often bookshops in your home country that will be happy to ship books with a special price if there is some sort of educational activity that you're planning to do in libraries or something like that. So if some of you, if you have friends and some of you partner up, this is actually a way to do it. And during the lockdown, you can still perhaps just kind of share the books and find a way to do it.
Yes, this is very important. One thing I would like to actually share in this respect is that in my experience as a mother of two trilingual children, I am Greek and my husband is from Iceland, and we live in London. So we have Icelandic, Greek and English at home. So I think the main issue is that, and what other parents report with regards to finding appropriate books, is that as children get older, they may not have these appropriate language abilities in order to understand particular books. So you may have books that they're quite childish from the thematic point of view. So you just, you know, it's difficult for the parents to just, so if you have a 9-year-old child, that of course, this child has different interests from a 5-year-old child, but the vocabulary is not at this level. So I think this is a big challenge for many families to just find books that they kind of address and they match both children's interests and language abilities at the same time. Okay, thank you for this. So I think we have half an hour, so we may have time for a few more questions from the registration form. I can see that we already have 4 questions in the Q&A forum. So let's continue with a few questions from the registration form. So can I ask Sarah again? How can you change a 4-year-old child's attitude when she or he refuses to reply in the minority language? I know that you've already talked briefly about it, but if you have any particular kind of tips, advice that you would give?
Yeah, it's tricky. Well, you're not gonna convince a child. I think it's like with teenagers, they have to think it's their idea to do that in a way. Well, so honestly, I have been reading a lot also on like multilingual websites about tips. I knew the story of the puppet. I have to say, I had tried them all. I had tried all the puppets. We have Italian friends. We meet with them every weekend. She was going to nursery with 2 of her Italian friends and would still only speak English to them, even though they have both Italian parents at home. So they are perfectly fluent in Italian and would speak to her in Italian, but she would still not do it. So in my daughter's, I think it's really child by child. You really need to look at what you've got, what you work with. And my child is very stubborn as the parents, so there is no way of convincing her of things. So in her case, it was really actually more the motivation. It was really the necessity. It was really the necessity with the grandmother, for example, that really triggered it. I have heard stories of parents that try to motivate, but not answering back if the child uses the wrong language. I never felt I could do that to my daughter. It's a personal choice. But I knew that wouldn't work with her. And I think, again, for us, it's been, like for me, it's been key in any case to have my husband's support, because I do have friends where one of the parents is not so supportive, or maybe it's not unsupportive, but just indifferent, while my husband has always been extremely, extremely keen on that. And so seeing like, if, which is kind of like mad, but like if he speaks Italian to her, he like, it's kind of like the German example of the flies. Like, oh my gosh, if daddy speaks Italian, it must be important. So suddenly she would try and speak Italian. So I think it's all those little motivators.
I know. This is very important indeed. And there was also one question about how important it is for the partner of the, the partner who speaks the societal language to have an understanding or speak the minority language. I think this is very important.
I mean, it makes life much easier. It makes my life much harder.
I know.
It's very hard as a grown-up to learn. I mean, my husband tried, but it's very hard as a grown-up. So I think it's important not to make anybody feel guilty about it. And
but it's an important factor.
It's very important. So even if you don't learn the other language, which I wish my husband did, at least the support and
yes, positive attitude. Yeah. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you. So let's move on to
Rosa, I think Liz wanted to say something.
Yes, please, Liz. Sorry, I did not see. Yes.
That's okay. I just wanted to use the opportunity to talk about how important grandparents are. Since, Sarah, you brought it up.
Definitely.
And what's interesting is that in general, we find in the literature that monolingual grandparents can play a decisive role in maintaining the home language, heritage language, as children do need to use the language to communicate with them. And I think your example was excellent. And also, if we look in the research literature, one study, not too old, for example, found that monolingual grandparents in families where the mother and father each spoke a different minority language were more successful than bilingual grandparents in passing on their language and cultures to grandchildren. But bilingual grandparents don't despair. I'd like to point that out. There's another important study that came out on a trilingual girl who was growing up in California with Tagalog from the Philippines, Spanish and English, and the child's maternal grandparents supplemented exposure to Tagalog from the mother, while her paternal grandmother gave extra Spanish input with their father. That way, both home languages were actually supported despite the prominence of English in society. And these were bilingual grandparents. So they did give more input and rich input. And I can also point out, this is my situation with my grandchildren. I supplement my daughter's input in English to them. And also grandparents in digital media communication. We haven't talked much about that, but I think that's an important thing. And of course, during the pandemic, that was really, sometimes we had to talk on FaceTime or Skype with someone else in the same city, right? Because we weren't allowed to mix households at certain points. And so I just wanted to point out, in a sense, we talk a lot about the parents' role, but I think you have given an excellent example. So it's important to look at all of the important interlocutors in the child's life. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you. This is very important indeed. Thank you. Okay, so I think we've addressed several of these questions in the presentations, I'm just looking, yes, now one for Naomi, so about schools. So how can schools help children maintain and develop their minority language or languages? And in a related note, how can schools support families during the pandemic and in the post-pandemic future?
Okay, so I need about a day to respond to this. There's several very large questions, so I'll try and keep it concise. I mean, the challenge we have here is that schools are different and they're serving very, very different communities. So some schools are serving, communities like the parents that Ludo and I interviewed who, are very proficient in several languages and highly educated and so on, whereas other schools are serving, you know, communities where the parents don't have that proficiency, don't have, you know, those the kind of financial resources with which to do things digitally and so on. So schools, it's very hard to generalize about what schools should or shouldn't do in relation to languages. But in effective schools that I've worked alongside, had the good fortune to work alongside, I guess one of the key things is that those schools send out the message that home languages are important and actively encourage families to use home language at home, and also find opportunities within the school day for home languages to be used as part of learning. For example, for children who are not yet so proficient in English, say in an English classroom, to be, you know, using it to think, a language for thinking and a language for making meaning. But I think perhaps if I wanted one ingredient to go out to, you know, every school or every teacher in terms of thinking about how to make sure that languages are developed per se for all children, if you like, and I mean monolingual children as well, that's that schools need to be following a very talk-based, oracy-based curriculum, because it's through talk that we find the opportunities to use and validate and value languages and explore how they work, and, you know, draw on the kind of benefits of the metalinguistic awareness that our multilingual pupils are going to have. So it's, you know, in a way sounds very simple, much more talk, but actually schools tend to be very literacy oriented, as indeed some parents have been, you know, worrying about the reading and the writing, whereas actually if you're not speaking well in either your home languages or the English that you're learning in an English school, for example, then, you know, you're not going to become very literate anyway. So that's probably key. I mean, good practice I've seen is things like schools making sure that they use the same systems for communication, whether it's, you know, during school term time and the children are in, or whether it's during periods of lockdown when children are at home, so that parents know there's consistency in terms of expectation. I've seen schools use for new to English learners or for parents that don't have much English. They do things like record podcasts about lessons or about curriculum content using bilingual teaching assistants, so that these are, you know, visual and in home languages. I've seen schools make great relationships with community members who themselves are perhaps confident English users and or confident whatever language it is that you're wanting to use users, and they also support parents in those ways. So sorry, that was a whistle-stop tour of a rather large number of considerations, but let's focus on that talk-based, oracy-based curriculum first and celebrate language.
Thank you, Naomi. This is very useful. Thank you. Okay, I think this will be the final question from the questions on the registration form. So this will be for the MultiLing team and the Reading team, in fact. So what is your advice for parents raising multilingual children based on your study's results? Would you encourage particular practices?
Shall I try to say something? Well,
do you
again,
want to go ahead?
it's a little bit like, you know, the $1 million question, to which we've kind of all tried to give partial answers, I suppose. I think for me, sort of one of the things that emerged, and, you know, one of the things that perhaps we predicted already before we started the project, is the importance of time and of children's ages. So a lot of the parents also brought this up in the interviews, to have, and especially during the first lockdown, there was this, you know, sense that time stood still a little bit. And then, you know, people weren't commuting as much, weren't doing all these extracurricular activities that obviously inevitably were pulling children out into the societal language. And that allowed parents time to also make space for activities in the home language. Something that, of course, gradually as children return to school and return to more of a, you know, usual life is going to be difficult. But perhaps the importance of ring fence, you know, sometimes some activities, some things that maybe, you know, arose, you know, for Sarah's child was like pretend play. For some children was learning to read. So some parents of young children sort of had this opportunity to teach them to read in, you know, in their home language before they started school. So but also the other thing, like I said, how important it is, for all parents, I suppose, to strike the iron while it's hot in a way, and I guess not to give up when children are young, and to persevere to some extent. And also because you were saying, also how difficult it is when you've got this, this gap between the children's, cognitive age, their interest, and what they can actually do in the home language, right? And then it becomes more and more difficult if you're trying to kickstart, I don't know, a reading habit when a child is 12 and they can barely read, words or short sentences. If you manage sort of to build this in while they're younger, and it progresses and develops over time, of course it is much easier, I suppose. And I was just wondering whether also this lockdown for some families might have amplified, some sort of holiday effect. I think a lot of families have this experience, right? Either, well, like in your case, when you have, family from abroad coming to stay, or the family spending more time, in another country where, where the language is spoken. And this kind of maybe a little bit encapsulated that. So all those things that you can do, although maybe here, as Liz saying, also you had to do virtually, some of these things are here to stay. So, and I think it's probably a good thing. I was talking to somebody on Tuesday, again, a grandparent, and before she was talking about communicating with her grandchildren at set times during the week, maybe Saturday afternoon or Sunday night, they were talking to, their grandchildren. And now, children were just picking up the phone at any minute. She said, I started playing hide and seek with my grandchildren on the phone. So they were taking me everywhere. So this fact that then the digital communication had opened up a space that was, that in principle was there already before, but it had never really been exploited. So, and I think, these qualitative changes also open up quantitative shifts, right? Because then this fact that you can pick up the phone and speak to grandma whenever you want, or she can do that, whenever she wants, or whatever, really also means that you get a lot more exposure in a lot more context, and potentially, for children that are learning to read or continuing to read. I think a German boy, I can't remember, Naomi, whether it was one of mine or one of yours, sort of read the whole Harry Potter saga in German. This child, could read, but had never really embarked. And again, motivation, this is such a captivating story, things that, the child really wanted to know what happened next. It wasn't just like, an exercise in literacy, they just wanted to know what was going on, and it happened to be in German because, I don't know, somebody gave them these books, and that happened. And then when you made the qualitative shift, I think, there is a knock-on positive effect, on so many levels. And, it's easier said than done. I'm not a parent, so, I'm just, preaching what I don't practice. So I have, a theoretical understanding of these things, and from talking to a lot of parents over the years. But I think, all those of you who are parents, who or researchers, like you said before, I think in assess opportunity and motivation, and so trying to find ways of creating these spaces. And I think these things are always there, but lockdown gave time to parents, right, to do this, I think, a little bit. And time is a precious commodity, is something that we might lose again a little bit, but I think some of the things will stay, because maybe we'll commute less anyway, even when the pandemic is over to some extent. So maybe some of this time will still be there, and certainly the digital communication is going to stay, I think. And also these other opportunities to use maybe apps that need to be developed, because I think gaming, right, for the children, they're into that. That's a massive pull. I mean, and so if you manage to embed the language in computer, especially for boys, but I don't want to be gendered here, but yeah, so that the sky's the limit, I think, on what you can do, right? And also because there is a lot of peer-to-peer communication in these games as well, which is also a very interesting thing, when it's not always just adult to child and child to adult, but peer-to-peer, which is, another whole big under-researched, I think, field.
And through different countries. They can just
exactly.
play. Yes, this is amazing. This is what everyone has actually been doing now.
Yeah.
It's very important. Thank you so much, Ludovica. Anything from Liz or Ellie?
You can go ahead first.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, thank you, Ludo. I think you expressed it very eloquently. It's very interesting, this notion of a space and how we've had this space, but it's been renegotiated and managed differently and pragmatically given the situation. One thing, though, what I've had in the back of my mind the whole time is that we tend to, well, it's also something that we could look more carefully at in the future, is that we tend to think that the parents finally have a lot of time for the children, but there are lots of parents who actually had to juggle more with their time at home because they had to move office to home, right? And I've noticed that with some of my colleagues at work as well. So that would be interesting. Those who basically had the time were unfortunately on furlough or, you know, on leave or whatever, as opposed to those who had to really juggle their time even more. It'd be interesting to see that. But this just opens up a whole panorama of issues that are worth exploring. But I agree with you completely. The digital is here to stay, and it's going to be interesting how that impacts language development. Ellie,
and just to add to that, because I was also thinking, you know, that I've talked to many parents that are in fact quite stressed, thinking that they are not, you know, making it to be a good parent now, neither with good workers. So that's definitely a struggle for a lot of parents. But at the same time, I also think, and this is more anecdotal evidence, but we also discussed this at some point, that some we also had a box to ask to add comments from the parents if they wanted to share something in the survey. And there was a few parents that said that because they were working from home and using English while working, that they actually saw that their kids were using more English, which I think is also quite interesting, because it was in some cases it was a language that was not really used by the kids so much. So you definitely are seeing changes in family and language dynamics, and based on this pandemic.
Thank you, Ellie. Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Ludovica, for these very informative answers. I think we shall stop with the registration form questions now, so that we can attend to the Q&A forum questions. So should we start with the first one? Yeah. So in Ludo's slides, I thought it was very interesting that there was a striking difference in the use of English versus home language in the computer games category. So do we know how much time the parents reported that their children spent on computer games per day? There are several sub-questions, so I don't know if you want to see it as well. So if it is a substantial amount of time per day or per week, which in the case of my family it certainly is, perhaps a recommendation to parents could be to actively search for games that have a version in their home language. And equally, maybe one can start support a movement to lobby games developers to do more about languages than their games are available in. I think that Ludo has already answered partially this question now before. So yes, if you want to add a few more things, Ludo, thank you.
Yeah, so we didn't actually ask. So we used a visual analog scale, and we asked parents to go from 0 to 100 on, you know, the important, you know, the amount of time the children. But we didn't ask in terms of like number of hours per day. So say like, does your child use this a lot from 0 to 100, right? So we don't have any quantitative data on whether it's like, you know, an hour a day as opposed to 5 hours a day or whatever. So we don't have that information. But yeah, so like we were just saying earlier, I totally agree. I think this is a market open for exploitation. And one, like I said, especially because for children of a certain age, this is really very motivating, right? Very stimulating, very engrossing. And also, like I said, it's got the added bonus that it's peer-to-peer. So even, you know, the kind of more authentic language, I am losing the language of my peers myself, right? So in a way, so I don't know about you, Sarah, but like, you know, not being, so I don't know, I'm not au fait with popular culture in Italy anymore. So I'm losing that in that sense. So let alone children, right? And in fact, language of peers is so important, because I remember this was like the children that used to, in Scotland, so Antonella's children actually, Froso, our joint supervisor. And they said, you know, these children spoke amazing Italian. They spent, you know, a lot of time in Italy. And I asked them if there was, you know, what gave them away as non-Italian children, right? Because they didn't even have an accent, because they had babysitters from all over Italy. So they didn't have a regional accent, but they didn't have an obvious Scottish or English or American accent. And they said basically the fact that they didn't know what children, the games that their Italian children were playing, the stuff that was on TV, which I'll have to say is probably true for like us attritive speakers, right, that have spent too much time away from our home country. So yeah, so I think gaming, obviously, because it's so motivating, so interesting, and it's got this peer-to-peer opportunity, I think it's fantastic. I think we should, yeah, definitely sort of get some startup funding next week and start on this. Forget
Definitely.
Start
pair up with the artificial intelligence people, and then linguists and artificial intelligence. Yes, this should be a perfect grant application. Yes. Okay, just another interesting question. So do you have any advice for parents who are not literate in their home language but desire their children to boost proficiency in the heritage language through reading in their L1?
Okay, maybe this is one for Naomi, I guess.
Yeah, this is, yeah.
That's a hard one, isn't it?
Yeah.
It must be quite stressful for a parent who's feeling that. I mean, I think what we do with kids in school in terms of learning to read, when we as teachers obviously don't have the home languages either, is we use ebooks a lot, so that you can get text that's being read to, and perhaps the parent might be able to find someone else who could at least look at kind of letter sound correspondences in the home language. So there's some kind of introduction to how that language works, the kind of whether it's phoneme based or whatever. So it might be a kind of a mix of that sort of thing. But yeah, ebooks might be useful and also quite motivational for reading as well in L1.
Thank you, Naomi. Yes, thank you.
Just on top of that, can I just ask, I don't know if anyone is aware, for example, I've been sort of listening to quite a lot of audiobooks lately, just because I'm going for walks and I'm into audiobooks. I wonder to what extent, because I've never really looked into that, whether this is something that is also available for children. So in terms, where you can listen to an audiobook and then potentially
yes.
That could be, in a way, something that you could have the same input from, two channels, and, the spoken channel maybe a little bit more familiar in a way into the reading, perhaps.
Yeah, this is a good suggestion. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, just one thing. When we had lockdown, my daughter had access to an app through the school, and she could, as they're just in reception, there was the part where she could read and also hear. And so I'm pretty sure that there is something around, like we've used a lot of radio, for example, a lot of radios from Italy or radio activities have moved to online. And so again, sometimes not even just making it about that specific language. She got really attached to Radio Magica, who has stories about cartoons that she knows, and they were also like in sign language. So she took an interest in sign language, and I was like, great, that's a language, so just, sometimes not focusing too much on your language or any language interest, and then can trigger, but yeah, there are like lots of like online stories that you can both read and hear at the same time. That could be useful.
Something else I came across with several of the families I interviewed was their children were learning other languages. I mean, languages other than the home language and English or whatever, which was interesting. And they were using things like Duolingo and other kind of self-help things as well. So that, I guess that would be a passport towards literacy, wouldn't it? Again, it's about affording things, isn't it? But that there were certainly quite young children using those quite independently.
Yes. And one of our attendees suggests the podcast. Yes, this would be very interesting to have podcasts for children. Yeah. Okay, thank you. These are all very good ideas. So another one, I think we have 3 minutes left. Ludovica, I don't know how strict is this. I mean, we have maybe 5-6 minutes more, or the webinar will just close 5:30.
No, it won't close, but I think, we might want to let people go if they've persevered.
Yeah, exactly. So just the last question. Yes, just the last question. So regarding literacy findings in the data Ludovica presented, did you collect any information on pre-lockdown literacy practices in the home? I am wondering if reading in the heritage language home language was common prior to lockdown.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so obviously we don't, because this was a study that just happened, we don't have like pre-lockdown data, but what, you know, our question was, do your children read or write more in the home language compared to lockdown, right? So that was the question. And like you will have, you know, seen from the charts that I presented, reading in the home language was much lower. We obviously only asked this for children who were literate already, was much lower in absolute terms compared to English, obviously, as you would expect.
Yes.
Also, because I would have to say the very vast majority of the children in our study attended mainstream English-speaking monolingual schools. There were a small minority of children that went to bilingual schools, but I have to say the majority of children obviously sort of had to do homework and read and write in English. So like I said, so we didn't really sort of, there was a little increase, but it wasn't something that was really major. Again, I'm talking statistically, so looking at the whole group of children, okay? So, and I mean, there wasn't an effect of age. So we couldn't compare like to a before and after, like I said, because we don't have a before. So we just asked, did they read more? And then we could just look at, did they read more as an effect of whether they were younger or older, or whether they spoke the home language of the parents or not. In absolute terms, when we were looking at quantity of reading, there was a significant effect of whether the children already use the language, the home language, to speak to the parent. So for example, if the child was already using Italian to speak to the Italian speaking parent, they were also the same children that read a lot in Italian, so to speak, right? But we did not find this effect when we asked, do they read more? But like I said, unfortunately, it was impossible really to do like a pre and post lockdown, because we would have had to know that lockdown was happening, you know, so we just couldn't collect this kind of data. Yeah.
Thank you, Ludo. Thank you, Ludo. And we all know about this relationship as researchers between oral skills and literacy skills, obviously. This is well established both in monolingual and multilingual acquisition. Okay, so in the last bit, which is very exciting, I suppose. So I am hearing some truly important questions from the audience here. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to attend this event. Thank you. Would the organizers consider writing up a report on the findings and in fact of the Q&A too? I know it's asking a lot from the organizers, but I could not ask.
Well, I guess we'll have to write this stuff up in a paper or two at some point, in the not too distant future. So that's one thing. We can certainly, I don't know if I want to promise to write a blog about this at this time, because this is a horrendously busy time. I might write like a short update, as I've done in the past for the people that took part in the study, obviously in the survey and in the interviews, so we've been keeping them up to date. The recording will be available online, so people are very welcome to watch it and rewatch it and make notes. I would like to say yes, but I don't know whether any of my fellow panelists can commit themselves at this stage to do something like this, because I don't know. I don't want, maybe, let's say maybe, I don't know.
Okay. Okay, then that's it for today. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending this event, and thank you to all the panelists and the colleagues for their very useful and informative contributions, as well as Sarah, our parent and participant, who gave us a very useful insight, and she described so thoroughly her successful story with her daughter. That's it from us.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.